And the recording has started. Welcome to the Green Cities Pittsburgh talk by Ray Gastil. My name is Rick Bell, and I'm privileged to be on the board of the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event, the 8th in a year-long series of discussions with thought leaders and municipal leaders from around the world on progress toward greener cities. First, a few quick logistical points. For AIA members seeking continuing education credits, this program merits one learning unit, at least we think so. That needs to be self-reported, and that's easy to do by visiting aia.org and clicking login and then transcript. The option to self-report will be offered under the continuing education portion of your profile. The abstract and learning objectives will need to be inserted, and you'll find those in the chat room for sure this time during the course of this hour. They'll be also available subsequently on the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization. The organizer of the series is the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization. It's a not-for-profit organization based here in New York City that builds connections between the United Nations, the design professions, academia, and allied associations. The stated purpose of the CSU is to advocate for responsible design and planning, increasing awareness about emerging issues, and facilitating knowledge transfer between policymakers, urbanists, architects, academics, and activists, not in that order. We do so by catalyzing cooperation and collaboration. At the same time, we promote the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, with particular emphasis on SDG 11 to, quote, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And we advocate for the new urban agenda, adopted 5 years ago this month, October of 2016, at the UN Habitat 3 meeting in Quito. Among its commitments were improving connectivity and supporting innovative and green initiatives and promoting safe, accessible, and green public spaces. I'd like to thank our partners in the Green Cities series, starting with the UN Habitat Office in New York, the AIA New York chapter and its Planning and Urban Design Committee. I see also people on the call from the Housing Committee, thank you. The UN Habitat Professional Forum, the NGO Committee on Sustainable Development, NY, the Center for Buildings, Infrastructure, and Public Space of Columbia University, the Creative Exchange Lab for Architecture and Design, and Perkins Eastman for providing the platform for this series. I'd especially like to give a shout out to Juan Guaron and Corey Asen of the Perkins Eastman Sustainability Team, which is providing that platform for the entire series. Thank you, guys. Lastly, I want to give special thanks to Lance J. Browns, president of the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization, for his leadership and for moderating the first 3 Green Cities talks. Videos of those talks and the subsequent ones for New York, Rio de Janeiro, Barcelona, Paris, Suane, Los Angeles, and Ljubljana are at the CSU website, which, not surprisingly, is consortiumforsustainableurbanization.org. Please visit that site to see our resources, publications, and upcoming events, including the next Green Cities talk on Thursday, November 4th. For today's program, please use the Q&A function to send your questions. We will get to as many of them as possible. Our guest today is Ray Gastil, who holds the David Lewis Hines Endowment's Directorship of Urban Design and Regional Engagement at Carnegie Mellon. In this role, he directs the Remaking Cities Institute and teaches architecture, urban design, policy, and planning. Ray previously served as the Pittsburgh Planning Director from 2014 to 2019, where he led initiatives to improve neighborhood planning, resilient communities, comprehensive planning, affordable and inclusive housing, waterfront planning, affordable urban design, open space, complete streets, public art, and historic preservation. I don't think he got any sleep in those days. He will talk also perhaps a little bit about the comparable work when he held similar positions in Seattle and in New York at the Manhattan office of the New York City Department of City Planning. Ray was the founding executive director, as many of us know, of the Van Allen Institute here in New York City from 1995 to 2004. In this role, he led exhibitions, publications, and design competitions, including open new designs for public space, and Beyond the Edge, New York's new waterfront. I entered and lost many of those wonderful competitions. Earlier, he served as regional design director at the Regional Plan Association. He's lectured and published widely on urban design, urban development, and waterfronts. His recent publications include essays on the history and contemporary design, as well as the planning of Pittsburgh's riverfront and the adaptive preservation of steel industry and distribution structures. He has taught architecture and urban design at the University of Pennsylvania, Pratt Institute, Carnegie Mellon University, Penn State University, and the University of California in Berkeley. He's a graduate of Yale College and received his Master of Architecture at Princeton. I should say the research done at the Remaking Cities Institute on changing mobility, changes to work patterns, resilient regional communities, engagement and citizen participation in the planning process, and most particularly on sustainable development, parallels the goals and educational programs of the Consortium, which both bring together people to discuss best practices and innovations. Cities learn from each other. So to conclude the introduction, as a kind of an invocation for the talk, was trying to find a new young poet, and the poet laureate, emerging poet laureate of Allegheny County, Paloma Sierra, is actually at Carnegie Mellon, or a recent graduate, but there wasn't anything that really fit into the mode. So instead, I'd like to quote a few lines from a better-known Pittsburgh native, although she denied her home city. That was, of course, Gertrude Stein, whose Buddha-like statue sits, by Joe Davidson, recasting of it, sits in Bryant Park in New York. And it helps to put everything and everyone else in perspective. In everybody's autobiography, Gertrude Stein wrote, I think in 1937, quote, "You are extraordinary within your limits, but your limits are extraordinary." I think that is high praise because, Ray, your work has proven that you have no limits. You take risks and you get things done. Without further ado, Ray, the floor and the screen is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Rick. And I will go to screen share in just a moment, but I want to thank you and Lance and the Consortium, and also, of course, Perkins Eastman for and the team with Juan and others that have made this possible. So let me go ahead to screen share. We'll just take a moment, and thank you for the generous introduction. Here we go. We're on our way. All right, I think we should be good now. So as Rick mentioned, I've worked in city planning but for many years, from New York in the Manhattan office, and in Seattle, and then in Pittsburgh for 5 years, well, actually 6 years rather, and now moving on to this work with Carnegie Mellon, also in Pittsburgh. So from a kind of public sector role now to one that's at the university. And just before we dive in, I'll just mention that Carnegie Mellon is a remarkable institution, and one which, it's, of course, it's a tier 1 research university, but it also has a very strong tradition of incorporating folks from the professional side, the government side, very much into kind of the work of the purpose and meaning of the school. So it's great to be part of this institution. So let's go to the next slide. Great City is Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh is very involved in many of the issues. It is daunting to be here in comparison to Schwane, or to Barcelona, or to Ljubljana, or so many of the other cities on that list. But let's just take a moment. I'm going to start here with this. Now, this is a former. It actually was built during World War II for weapons manufacturer. It did have a period as a sort of steel mill building, and then it sort of had a ignominious final round, is sort of where you stored the bricks for a coke oven. But this was Mill 19. It's on the site of Hazelwood Green. And I'm showing this because this is actually only 2.3 miles from the center of downtown Pittsburgh. This is in a neighborhood called Hazelwood, a neighborhood that was much larger when this was a thriving industrial city. but is actually rebuilding. And one part of it is this part, which is actually a large parcel, 178 acres, in which they have made some strategic decisions about preservation, such as this building. But I'm asking you to look at it for two reasons, not just because of the park in the front, which is designed by Gustafson Guthrie Nichols, or the sort of, the kind of this amazing, remarkable sort of steel frame, which you can't see the solar array, or you can just see the tip of the solar array to see some of the ways this building is being thought of as sort of something that has a sort of almost contemporary industrial function in a way, or at least a contemporary. But what also you wouldn't know is you're looking at the buildings or the edge of a building, which includes not just that sort of stage, which is there for sort of cultural events and so forth, but you're looking at the Advanced Robotics Manufacturing Center. So that, this is really, it's quite deliberate, the kind of ways in which Pittsburgh has put new innovation technology and green right in the heart of older industrial sites. This was a site that employed 3,000 people. This was a site that had, incredibly all the sort of fire and flame and heat and danger of a classic steel production, or actually iron production site. But here it is in a new way. But I'm asking you to look at it to sort of see, not that, in some ways, this kind of part of the sort of secret of Pittsburgh's success and sort of thinking itself through about how to be a more sustainable city has been, while much of its past is erased, and much of its past would actually be very hard to sustain in a sustainable city in terms of the industry's impact on the environment and on society. At the same time, that there's a sort of through line which we find, which is that there's often, this adaptive reuse in a very deliberate and sort of a way about saying, like, here is this heritage of steel, it's still here, but at the same time, we're doing something different now. Not divorced from the industrial world, not divorced from manufacturing. It's not like a kind of complete move to an R&D or to a sort of, but at the same time, a different version of it. So, as I like to say, it's like we're one of the great success stories for smaller cities coming out of a kind of industrial era in many ways, although the success is qualified by some things we'll talk about in a moment. But I sometimes think we're otherwise industrial, especially if you look at the region. It's like, while yes, steel as it was known is gone, there's actually a great deal of manufacturing and industrial activity in the region, and also even within the city limits, although within the city limits largely in an R&D format. So this is what most people think about Pittsburgh, although maybe we need more actual steel mills. But I'm going to very briefly give us some history, because it's like a lot of times people tell this story of Pittsburgh or places like Pittsburgh, and when they're sort of talking about renewal and renaissance, and also like the whole question about how our larger contemporary 21st century question of how to be sustainable. But I just want to sort of underscore in this image that the cities are never just industrial. I mean, this is about as industrial a downtown as you can get, without putting the factory at City Hall. This is very close. This is the point. It's very close to the center of what were, in fact, even in 1900, there were Fortune 500 scale companies and headquarters. There was a corporate office zone. But at the same time, this was always very close. The actual, the barges moving coal, bridges moving trains. But I want you to just take a notice here that, like, at the same time, there was already a baseball field on the water. Yes, there was a huge train yard in front of it, but a baseball yard. This was Exhibition Hall. And this, I always love this one because it's like this little shape here. This, of course, is a roller coaster. And the roller coaster is like, it always makes me smile, because like here we are in this river, which at this point is like not a very safe river. And it's going to actually, fortunately, go through some major reform changes in the early 20th century. But I just want to remember, here we are in 2020, 2021. And we sometimes forget that, like, we've kind of been here before. We've been at moments, inflection points, when we realized that the kind of system we had wasn't working, or was like, may have been generating wealth, but it was also generating all kinds of inequity and health damages and so forth. And Pittsburgh was very aware of this. It had the famous kind of the Pittsburgh Survey, which was sort of funded by Russell Sage, which would go on to support the New York Regional Plan a decade later. Which was just this incredible work of really looking at what was right and what was wrong with the city. And I think that, while it comes in waves, Pittsburgh has always been working to see how it could be both. Could it have this sort of prosperity, this sort of extraction and production economy as part of what it is, and at the same time always have a place for the other parts of what makes a city livable, and from clean water ultimately to also the questions of recreation and amenities. It was never as though there was a world with zero amenities except up the hill. There was always a notion that there was that here too. So this is a 1920s. You can see by the Model A's, I think, that are in the picture. It's slightly ironic to me in a way, because in some ways this is a sustainable city. It's got a walk to work. It's got housing near where you work. Everybody is not driving a car. In some ways, it's sort of, people are actually getting exercise. At the same time, they're next to this mill, which is the same one, which is I showed you in that first picture. It's a different view of it at a very different time. But this is when the iron and coke production was in full activity, which the very last of that ends in the 90s. But it's an industrial neighborhood again. But now this one, in a way, it's like it has to walk to work and so forth. But they're not. But they know that it's not right. It's 1920s. They know this isn't good enough. Nobody is deluded that this is the way it should be. This is the Pittsburgh plan of that era, which I often, we think of data as sort of being, trapped inside digital bits. In fact, this is data of its time, very contemporary kind of perspective of like how many people live within a 10-minute walk, or here it's a 15-minute walk. They're a little more ambitious then, but a 15-minute walk of a park, and looking at the problems and where they needed to make different kinds of investments. Now, some of these things are sort of like great plans that then don't get a follow through. But at the same time, here we are literally 100 years ago, much of the same type of thinking that we would do today about how to make a park system more equitable, more available to more people. And so while Pittsburgh doesn't always succeed in these efforts, I think I just want to stress that it has done efforts like this, which line up with many of our sustainable city and resilient city goals of today. They line up with it from earlier efforts. And I think that, there's a cumulative effect, that there's something to learn from the earlier efforts, both the humility, which is like you set out these goals and you don't always reach them. And then also that sometimes it's something like, urban renewal and so forth, the whole armature of the goals was out of alignment with how a city really needed to be and needed to grow. This is just, we're 1938. And again, I will stop harping on the fact that there was always sort of a recognition that these rivers, oftentimes when they tell the story of Pittsburgh, like nobody ever went to the river. The rivers were totally off limits. It was they were just dirty, terrible things. And I sort of show this picture to remind people that, well, I can't deny the memories that people have of growing up here and their parents telling them never go down to the river. I can't, those are facts. I can't deny that. But I still look at images like this to underscore that a city like this is always thinking, has always been thinking, really, at least since the late 19th century, about how to sort of reckon with its the activity and its industry, and at the same time have some amenity and some pleasure in life, as well as more sort of technical sustainability metrics. So, and this is a celebration of the 150th anniversary of the city. It's also, there was similar celebrations when they finished channelizing the rivers and various other items. But this crowd is extraordinary, all on the riverbank, all enjoying a day, looking at the boats. The bridges in the distance are bridges that are aesthetically driven. This was the city's art commission was the one that reviewed the original designs for the bridges and said they weren't good enough, and told them to come back and have a more contemporary engineering and a more elegant design than the ones originally proposed. And then what's happened is these three bridges are now known as the Three Sisters, and are named for Rachel Carson, Roberto Clemente, and Andy Warhol, which again is sort of a 70s kind of, or later than that, but perhaps moment of kind of identity for the city. This is I think speaks for itself. I don't have to explain what's happening here. This is people who believe in a headquarters city and reshaping that point, which I showed you earlier. And it took a very long time to create this Point State Park, but it did happen. And this was through that kind of, concentration of power, which is sort of negative, most negative aspect is sort of urban renewal itself, but on the other hand, some very effective new public spaces and some economic development. And this is the city as we see it today. I mean, again, you don't see much industry in this picture, but you do see the stadiums, which are actually in the same place they were 100 years earlier, and you do see the sort of office center and housing mixed in with the downtown and various other parts of a contemporary thriving economy. So this is, as I say, people also remark upon us the overnight success. Pittsburgh really was working on innovation as a kind of focus of its identity, its kind of economic identity and a driver. Really 30 years ago, and I'll just show you, this is the Robotic Center, which was opened in '86 in this building, which was actually was a 19th century foundry building in the Lawrenceville neighborhood. This was, one of the key moments in the sort of remaking of Pittsburgh sort of circa 1980s and onwards, which it began to say, yes, steel industry collapsed. Yes, we have a new condition, but we're going to rebuild in different ways. And we're going to use our strengths from the hospital system and UPMC to the strengths of what was emerging as a discipline, which is robotics, which Carnegie Mellon became one of the real sort of centers for research and development of that, and also was kind of moved relatively early in the kind of low technology transfer kind of approach to this as well, that it was not just the university research, but it was also part of a larger economic system and potential. There's all, this picture has, even in the corner, all kinds of really, extraordinarily rich Pittsburgh associations. There's a railroad right in the middle of town that's still there. There is across the river, a remarkable church with some of the most beautiful murals of the 20th century in North America. But and then that landscape of hillsides, which has also been characteristic of it, which again is part of why it has been able to sort of have this attention to sustainability for a long time. This is an image of this was a steel plant which was transformed, and it was planning in the 80s as well, when they said, you know what, this steel plant is going to become a technology center, sort of an R&D center, both university affiliated and also beyond the university. So this very deliberate planning, which went on for decades, with in part an urban redevelopment authority. You had that type of government and semi-government entity that was able to sort of move large projects forward, and that's been an extraordinary part of the city's history. So innovation, now I don't know if we're at 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, 5.0, I don't know where we are. This was Pittsburgh became one of the main testing sites for autonomous vehicles, one of the main research sites, again, largely because of the sort of strength of the Carnegie Mellons, so the ecosystem that built around robotics and related fields and AI, et cetera. This was sort of this moment. So I come to Pittsburgh when this is really all just coming together. I mean, we're about a year in, and I do help organize this conference on AV and autonomous vehicles and urban design and all these kind of issues. At the same time, though, we know that we're facing challenges that are beyond just the sort of what do we do next to kind of prove our innovation chops. How do we what do we do next besides sort of being in a competitive position, perhaps, to get Amazon headquarters too. Well, some of the ways we began to look at it was this is still in that same way of thinking. We're kind of like, okay, we're going to think really closely about this is the materials that were actually prepared, in fact, in that competition process, and then the sort of what came afterwards when we were competing actually for this was not for Amazon. This was for a Department of Transportation and federal major sort of center, which in the end Columbus won that competition, but Pittsburgh got a great deal of other projects and work out of that same moment in time of that moment with the Obama administration. This is just showing you downtown Pittsburgh, and this both has strengths and weaknesses in it. Now I'll explain why. You have the downtown, and you have the North Shore, and they are places that do indeed make sense for energy and microgrid. To some degree, they have microgrids already, although not completely. We actually set a goal in the administration of Mayor Peduto to reach almost 50% of the city to be off the grid or on a microgrid. And then there was also a transportation aspect here. SureTrack is about using camera visual computing technology to actually improve traffic flow, which is related to some of the work I'm doing out in the suburbs, actually. But there's also a problem here, in that we are, the sort of classic of like, here we have this huge neighborhood in the center, which is not kind of overlaid as a district, as a smart spine. And this is, although there is actually a spine going through it, which is the Hill, which is the area which is a famously community of color, was most famously in the plays of August Wilson, and also where urban renewal was a striking blow on the sort of lower 28 acres of it. And so there's this tension. It's like, here we are being innovative and progressive and thinking about new ways of thinking about the city, both in terms of energy and sustainability, and also sort of an innovation ecosystem. Yet are we kind of once again sort of falling into some of the ways that of thinking from the 60s in which sort of neighborhoods were kind of cut out of those visions. And so those kinds of issues were very much when we sort of began to sort of realize we needed to kind of have an inclusive innovation approach. And there was, we had a great leader in the department with Deborah Lamb, who's now leads a sort of state of Georgia and Georgia Tech program on sustainability and sustainable communities based in Atlanta. But Deborah helped lead us to a kind of inclusive innovation position, which was like, how do we put a lens on this? Which is, a lot of that means just that people can enter the workforce. Some of it means people are trying to get to enter the education space. Some of it is just saying like, they kind of like there's sort of the jobs or at least some training should be available. And then also that the way you think physically about the city needs to change to recognize that you can't sort of put all your chips in one neighborhood. That like, what can we actually, there still do need to be centers, there still need to be clusters, there may need even to be a smart spine, but there are some other ways to think about this in the same way that we began to rethink our transportation system, especially in the last couple of years. So one of the ways to think about this was using the eco-district model. We used it first in, this is actually from the eco-districts held their conference in Pittsburgh, I think in fall 2019, and this is just a slide that from their deck then. But we'd worked on eco-districts and we sort of crafted this term eco-innovation district in a neighborhood, which is actually one of those that you just saw in that picture of the kind of map of Pittsburgh. And sort of this is this contemporary planning and just sort of trying to think, but this is all part of, we had some resources for this planning project because it was related to a transportation project, because we were determined to build and will be building a bus rapid transit system from downtown to Oakland and sort of points beyond. But when as you may all know, at least in the American model, transportation projects are often when there's some money freed up for planning. And that was the case here. But we were also trying to set a pattern for planning in neighborhoods. So because when I got to Pittsburgh, there hadn't been a city-sponsored neighborhood plan in a I don't know, 12 years, something back to sort of 2003 or so. And so we were really trying to turn the page on that and say, we want the neighborhoods to own these. At the same time, the city should be there. And also neighborhood plans need to be something that gets approved by the city. So they have some teeth. So they have, the way we translate them to zoning, but also just even as guidelines to become a tool. And we've been using it. There is, in fact, an extensive plan was done, some zoning changes were done, and we actually use the guidelines of the plan when a project comes in front of us in the eco-innovation district in this neighborhood, we look through that. But we didn't keep it just in that neighborhood. We also went to the communities that had sort of the paucity of resources, generally communities of color, Homewood, Hazelwood, where that sort of large plant was, as well as Manchester and there's others that have that we have now. It took a while. It took a while for people to believe in it because they hadn't been used to. The city had to become a trusted partner again. We had to work with trusted leaders to try and establish that. But I had come from cities where planning departments were very involved in neighborhood planning, so I believed it could be done. And we now, by the time I left my position in 2019, we'd had 3 of them passed, and now I think there's 8 of them passed. We also moved to having recognized community organizations. All of these are hard work because they're establishing trust. There's always something that could be better. There's always questions about, recognition, what does that mean? And there's always questions about, is this really going to help people shape their neighborhoods? But we felt compelled to do it. We also felt compelled to do it in a way that, and I'm happy to say that passed, and they're part of the way the city works now. But we also felt compelled to look at the riverfront as a whole. That was a major initiative. We looked at affordable housing. We had a task force, and then we began to do concrete things, including inclusionary zoning on a sort of neighborhood basis rather than a citywide basis. We also developed what P4, which I'll show you a slide about in a moment, as well as the resilience plan. We were one of the cities that was like that series that, national sort of 100 resilient cities were funded with Rockefeller monies and others. And we, established our Office of Sustainability, and we really moved on that. And that kept us in a kind of national and international dialogue about what are the best practices and then translating that. We brought the eco-innovation into the way we did our planning. We don't, the Pittsburgh region has some great eco-innovation projects largely kind of been on a consultant basis, led by my colleague, Christine Mondor. But in those in Millvale and the towns on the Allegheny, which have sort of are among the first recognized, established, sort of confirmed eco district plans in the country, actually. And that's one of the reasons the conference was held in 2019. In the city, we follow the eco district principles. They're built into what we do, but it became less of a was using the model more as a sort of key reference point and a recognized reference point. At the same time, not the same strategy was used in those communities. Neighborhood planning, the Pittsburgh 2030 district is the largest 2030 district in the country, in which there's a voluntary assemblage of all the businesses and all the institutions, agreeing to sort of monitor their energy use and move towards 2030 goals for energy use reduction. It's been one of the most successful of those programs. That was underway sort of just before, I think, it was right at the beginning of the Purdue administration in 2013, 2014. And then Sustainable Development Goals, which we took the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and again, we sort of overlaid them on our planning process. We overlaid them on the way that we do neighborhood planning in the city, even though it didn't have to be, we tried to both have them there and have them present. At the same time, we weren't trying to burden a neighborhood planning process with so many metrics and so many frameworks. And then finally, speaking of like this move to making sure we were addressing equity concerns as we worked on the resilience plan and took it forward, one of the things we did that was a very tough thing to do, but we worked with CCNY on a model that was looking at equity indicators, and particularly ones of race, but also other aspects of equity, and then sort of seeing, doing a kind of analytical thing to see where where it was health delivery, not just land use questions, but where were the gaps, where were the most sort of obvious gaps, the most concerning gaps, and then set up a system in which we would every 2 years report out on how we were doing. Now that we got through that the first couple of years, and then we shall see whether we're able to sort of sustain that, but as a kind of metric. But at the same time, those metrics have been put out there, and it was one of the many ways which we said, we know we have to do better, but we need to look at that from a data perspective as well. So on people, place, plan, and performance, I just wanted to, this was a sort of one of these systems to develop. This was a great deal of work. We created this P4. It was like with resources from the Heinz Endowments and others. And we developed a kind of whole system. It also became a metric for development, reviewing a development plan. But again, we developed a system, which was a sort of Pittsburgh driven system. And it's like, and this one is part of what we do now. Whether it stays in all its form as kind of the system in perpetuity, we will see. But at the same time, it was critical in getting our heads around and sort of being able, by creating our own metrics, we're also able to better understand all the metrics that are out there, whether it's LEED or others, or the the SDGs sort of being turned into metrics. We had done that work, and it's still part of the work that I was proud to be part of. So this is just to give you a sort of sense of that one side I was mentioning. You can see that that Mill 19 in the center of this is before this. I think this is 1998 or early 2000s. This is the kind of rendering of what it will become. All kinds of issues and complexity about how it will work with the neighborhood, but that's been part of the neighborhood planning work that was done there, as well as the planning for the site work that was done. I think that it's it's making a strong play for sustainability, resilience. It's a harder equity is a harder bar to reach, but that is in the thinking and the work of the project today. One other note over on the other side, you see the green on this hillside. This is going to be a 600-acre urban wilderness park, one of the largest of its kind in the country, which will take a long time before it's really in operation. But we made a clear move to keep it natural, let it come back from its mining and other uses history, and have this incredible green reserve at the edge of a sustainable city. And this is just, I'm going to just go through these quickly because we're at 9:35, and this is just sort of views of how this kind of question of how Pittsburgh used its past, pulled it through. This is a hot metal bridge that had 3,000-degree ingots of iron going across. Now it's for bikes and pedestrians. This is just a reminder that the complete streets is sort of building off of these kind of a culture that at the same time, and how does this become something that's not just a sort of Sunday afternoon? How does this become part of the city's real system of both of mobility and recreation, which is something that Pittsburgh's been working on for some time. This is just that the sort of DNA of Pittsburgh includes these remarkable concentrations of were in fact communities before the era of the automobile. And even if they don't have that many stores, they have a concentrations of uses that are extraordinary in terms of like thinking through what a complete community could be, learning from the past of our step system, remembering that, all our brick streets are actually permeable. Is there a way to do them today? Well, in fact, there is. Reusing steel structures like this one between new housing and office buildings, using spaces like this 1,500-foot rail terminal, rethinking it. This was with Stoss, landscape urbanism, and then with Antonovich and others. And then with the final completed version is not quite as dramatic, but it was actually, and this is a little bit dry, but it's happening. People love sitting here. They love biking here. They love, the shops are now all open. This is a picture from a bit earlier, but this was a critical adaptive reuse, as you know, is really a sustainability practice. At the Remaking Institutes, we're going to get to the end of the presentation in one moment. This is just RCI. I'm going to just talk about one of the lines of work we're doing because it's the one with the most sponsored research at this time, which is in mobility space. But I just want to, future of work, future of centers. We've been doing some scenario modeling, sort of trying to use the fact that one is at Carnegie Mellon and one has this incredible ecosystem of technical and capacity, whether it's in using cameras to analyze pedestrian flow or whether it's in using the kind of epistemics, working with them and others to sort of generate kind of synthetic populations, sort of look at scenarios for like what's going to happen with our downtowns so only half the people come back, and that type of work. And then finally, there's a regional aspect of this. It's in the job title, it's in the institution's foundation, that we're not supposed to be just focused on the city of Pittsburgh, but also the region. Which regional evidence. We're in the middle of a region which actually has more than just, this is like some of the work we're doing. We're working in Shaler. This, as you can see, is the largest suburban community. This is their de facto Main Street. They only turn it, pedestrians really only have much place here twice a year. But at the same time, there's shops, there's services, there's schools, there's parks, and there's a way we're trying to think about, whether there's a shared mobility model, beyond just a bike lane, although getting a bike lane here is actually be quite a great achievement. But we're trying to sort of develop these models. That's something I'm doing with my colleagues at Remaking Cities Institute, and also with the support of Traffic 21, which is a sort of key center for transportation and mobility, and also in the case of intersecting with us, urban design research. And this is sort of how we get to another town, another area. We're looking at it where we're thinking about a 5-minute and 15-minute city, but we're like, well, what if it's actually linear? What does that mean? Well, of course, it means you can't really do the short walks the whole length. But with biking, it's trying to think of, there's sort of patterns that we don't always notice that like could achieve some of those same goals of places with shared mobility. And so how to kind of unpack that and looking at, just in fact, you wouldn't know if you go down these streets that this could be a 5-minute neighborhood, but it could. And this is just sort of on the ground of different ways we've looked at it. Finally, just sort of ending on a mobility note, although that's by no means not the only thing we do, but all this work on shared mobility is also with a kind of, strong relationship with that transit doesn't go away. In fact, we kind of need transit for, that whole shared mobility, complete street and even complete community. You can never really make it work without some kind of baseline transit, which is a challenge for the US sometimes, but, nonetheless, we actually have transit everywhere. We just don't always deploy it with the full kind of seriousness and resources that it merits in any kind of future system. And so finally, this is just the areas that we work, and that's that's sort of, we will be working in others, but with RCI, the associated faculty and researchers and team, and as well as, and within the School of Architecture where I'm housed. Finally, just note that there's a lot of, Traffic 21, Metro 21. We have a lot of centers, and the Center for Shared Prosperity is now another really interesting group. We have a lot of entities within the university as well as beyond to kind of like achieve this work. So thank you very much. And I think I've taken plenty of time, and I'm going to actually stop sharing so that I can see you all and we can work from there.
Thank you, Ray. One of the comments in the chat room is that I think Ben Moore said that there was no reason to end the presentation. We could go on much more than 35 or 40 minutes. So we'll do that as city planning used to do, and still does, by asking questions. So the time limit gets obviated by you could have an unlimited amount of time to respond to the questions. We have several from the audience, but I'd like to jump in, first of all, by thanking you. Cities learn from each other, and I think what New York can learn from what you're doing now and what's been done in Pittsburgh in the recent past are on things that, from 10-minute walkways, walkthroughs, the definition of what is a complete neighborhood as it relates to Parisian 15-minute neighborhood. How do you find the resources to add the facilities that make for a complete neighborhood when historically certain neighborhoods were under-resourced? All those economic questions, I think, come also to my mind from the demographics of Pittsburgh. I see a population decline. I tried looking at the numbers historically.
I can give you the numbers, Rick. I can help you with that if you want.
Yeah, well, I have them here, and Pittsburgh was 1,000,008 people in 1960, stayed pretty constant in 1980, and it declined in population and still is since then. On the other hand, Allegheny County, the metropolitan area, was still in 2019 over 1,000,000, 1.2 million. That implies a lot of need for connectivity. So I've got a lot of questions, but they relate to the economics, demographics, transportation, connectivity, in no particular order. And I'm intrigued by the things that relate to a future city that you mentioned, almost in passing, like bus rapid transit was anticipated, not quite in place. How do those decisions get made? Where's the money coming from?
Okay.
Well,
Uh,
let me break that up a little bit.
well,
Where's the money coming from?
no. Well, first, Pittsburgh did have a population of over 650,000 in 1950, and now it's more like 300,000.
Yeah.
It's 300. We were getting a little higher when I got to Pittsburgh, and but we didn't. We'll see what comes out of the 2020 census in final terms, but we don't expect. We stabilized. I mean, basically, the good news was after 2000 we stopped losing population.
Yeah.
The region, though, as you know, it's very much like Buffalo, for example, a lot of other places where regionally population didn't really decline that much. Declined, but not that much. Basically, it was suburbanization. And I just saw a presentation about Buffalo. It's dramatic, the zero change in population, and 50% increase in urbanization on a regional level, that's just straight up suburbanization. But in Pittsburgh, what we're trying to do right now in Pittsburgh about this kind of mobility is we're not making big claims about retrofitting suburbia at this point. I mean, very aware and admire the work of Ellen Dunham Jones and June Williamson on this. But what we wanted to do with this particular project was actually look at this sort of what are really they're kind of inner suburbs. They're almost like neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. And it's like, instead of like sort of assuming, well, they're just almost, but they don't really have enough, and so they'll never really be like an urban neighborhood. It's like, no, actually, they kind of could be. They kind of are. They may have come from a streetcar suburb era. They have the service. It may be that on those, you've got 4 towns in a row and there's only one grocery store, but there's still a grocery store. And right now, people do even take the bus up and down that road to go to the grocery stores, or walk up and down that road to get the groceries. And they do go from town to town. Not that much, because it's something that the towns aren't all equal, and there's not you to have that change. Ultimately, you probably would want some infill and so forth to really make the model work. But at the same time, you got to look at these things that may not quite make it to the model and think, yeah, you could build there though, and not necessarily with development, but even if you could just sort of help people be aware of what they got. That this main street that they think of as just one place, it's actually 4 places, and if you put them all together, you've got quite a set of resources. In the same way, and so it's really building on that kind of neighborhood version of kind of that is even in the suburbs, and it may not, it doesn't get the Parisian numbers. It doesn't. I know Duane has and Stoichville have a very good metric of kind of like how much density you need, which is not. It doesn't have to be as dense as Paris. It's sort of like half the density of Paris, and it still works. But I still want to push people to look at these models in a different way. The money for doing BRT and so forth, BRT is some of these projects are what in political terms, it was about a very cohesive relationship between the mayor and the county. We have a county executive and we had a mayor system. And when those two are aligned, you have a lot of opportunities for like the way you go to the feds, the way you go for the DOT and FTA, the way you kind of apply for monies. You could, make sure that your application for BRT would be meaningful, would be, and it would had the full support it needed to move forward. It also moved forward because we said the community pushed back. They said, you're building a BRT through our neighborhood, but what do we get out of it? And like we said, we don't want it. Well, it was like one of those that was when it was like, well, let's see if we can, that's when we put the resources into working with that community to see, well, what would make this neighborhood everything you want it to be? And also what can we do to make sure that it doesn't feel like you're a place to go through, but you're a place to go. So that's how we also, there's a lot of learning from other cities. The leadership team had been very inspired by the work in Cleveland on the new kind of bus rapid transit they've got there. Pittsburgh never has wide streets, so we can't, all these things we can't do because we've got streets that are like as narrow as a village in the hills of the Massif Central in France. But it's nonetheless, we work with what we have to try and achieve these things. I know there's so many other things, questions, but Rick, you're going to have to give me another version of it. One or two.
So, there are more eloquent and more succinct versions of the same question from the audience. I'm going to jump to one of the first ones from a member of the audience, from Tom D'Alessio, who he's at Rutgers at Blaustein now, but was a long time at NJIT. Tom had two somewhat related questions. The biggest challenge for Pittsburgh in relation to climate change and the metrics, what do you think need to be used on a local, state, and national scale to help Pittsburgh reach all of the goals that you were describing? Is it Biden infrastructure funding, or is there some, data that you're analyzing, visualizing at Remaking Cities that helps to substantiate the case for Pittsburgh's positive future?
I think we'll be doing a lot of that. I don't think that, in a sense, the city has, and the Allegheny Conference, which is this sort of, kind of like a regional plan association type entity here, have probably more of the data that is sort of as well as the county and the state, pushing an agenda about resources coming from the Recovery Act and that kind of work. So I don't want to overclaim in terms of data or studies that my group particularly is generating, although CMU at large does a lot of that work as well as Pitt. But I'll say this. Because I know this from having been with the city and today. It seems like one of the greatest sort of climate change danger to the city in terms of just resources, disruption is probably landslides. The rain events, we are nothing but hills, and the rain events and a lot of our hills and our infrastructure is very we call some of our streets goat paths, and that's it's symptomatic of this is that my very first day on the job, I couldn't find anyone to talk to me. I couldn't find my boss because they were all involved with a landslide that had cut off the railroad on at the south side, and so that was a pretty primary issue. But I also know, and so that's one. The second thing I would say that in Pittsburgh, which is sort of relatively subtle, compared to certain other places. But I do think we're going to be, as we get wetter, we have our stock of housing. And I have studied some of this. And again, we're not, my colleagues are involved with active research on this on interior air quality and so forth. But I know this from other work that we did and as we prepared a couple of things. The dangers to our community, and especially folks who live in older housing stock, because our average house is like from 1940 or so. We do have older housing stock, which, many wonderful aspects to that in terms of character. But it also translates into having a lot of problems with mold and which seems so, but that's what happens. Increased wetness and increased heat translates into increased mold and translates into a health crisis where we already have, a baseline of folks and children, and especially communities of color with asthma, and it's like, and that, and all it takes is, 3 degrees more, or like, 10, 90 degrees in a row, or rain events of an inch or more. You start adding that up, and those things become very impactful. We have a great Department of Health Services. We have a great folks at Green Building Alliance, one of our many kind of leading sort of civic groups and organizations is also integrated with government in certain ways, working on this, and we'll continue to have that work going on. And I have colleagues that are studying this, and in both kind of applied and like how to help people like take care of the problem, but also, and because all these things take money. I mean, it's also because we're not a city that everybody has this high income and so they can fix up their old house and there's no question about it. It's like we're like, people don't have those kind of resources. So we have to be strategic about it. And, those are, again, they're not systemic. They're more like, what you're specific, but you have to have a systemic way of responding to those, even though it's in the end, it's individual houses, in the end, it's individual hillsides.
Yeah, you mentioned health services in passing. One of the questions from distinguished member of the audience, Lance Brown, who's the president of the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization, was specifically how has COVID impacted the thinking about Pittsburgh's future? Every city has been impacted differentially, some to a very great degree, and others much less because of leadership and health facilities in place. What's the story in Pittsburgh?
Well, it's like other places, we learned a lot about our streets. We actually this is sort of the kind of happy version of in a sense that you could do interesting things through streets. You could have different type of curbside management. That people were outside. That the restaurants could be outside. That you took a more liberal attitude about how to allow tables to be placed and so forth. That it becomes more kind of, in many ways, the things you'd want to do in a city anyhow. But they have a health driver, and they also meet actually at the same time. There's real concerns for the people that work in delivery and work in restaurants, trying to keep them employed. And so that Pittsburgh actually had some really good work done on that. It had an incredible report done on that, and acted on it. And usually in kind of sort of concentrated places like the Cultural District and others, but they really did some things. And there's costs and benefits. But I think we're never going back to quite the same attitude about curbs and how we use them. And we needed to change that, both in recognition of autonomous vehicles in the future, but really also in recognition of rideshare and delivery and everything, and COVID, and other ways of mobility. And it's hard. We're trying to share streets. COVID really got us to share streets. The other thing that I'd say that came out of COVID was these are kind of we don't know how many people are going back to downtown. It's not quite as dramatic as New York, but it's the same story. We don't know. I mean, because what happens, and this is the work that I was doing with the epistemics and Kristen Kurland and my colleague, it's because it's a simple math. If 80% of the people are going back to work, and then you say, oh well, the economy will take care, we'll grow and we'll get back to 100%, which is the kind of optimistic CBRE kind of position. But at the same time, if people actually only go back to work half time, they're really, because it's like 80% will go back, but they're not all going back every day. And so de facto, you got 50%. And even with a relatively modest impact of COVID kind of position. And 50% does change all the stuff about all the services and stores and shops and jobs and stuff of how a downtown works. So that's an impact which is happening here. We still don't really know. But it has happened, and we're still grappling with the reality of that. And we'll see. And finally, there have been, like a lot of places, COVID has been, we were doing incredibly well on addressing homelessness. We've had really good policies and so forth, and practices. And now, COVID kind of has undermined that. But, fortunately, because of resources and so forth, we're trying to work out on that again. And I'm advising a student team that's sort of looking at the whole Allegheny County homelessness strategy now. But it's about COVID, for all the obvious reasons, has had an impact on that. Increase the danger, increase the risk, and increase the vulnerability of folks.
Changing topics a little bit, it's a very special month at the United Nations, and we're also celebrating, this week, World Habitat Day. One of the questions from from Irina Zubčević, who's just started with the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization, helping out in all sorts of wonderful ways. So her question pertained to the Sustainable Development Goals. One of your slides suggested that they were inspirational for some of the things that you're doing. Can you be a little bit more specific about how they may impact policies that the city has done, or at RCI, how you incorporate sustainable development goals in making recommendations and in formulating research proposals?
It's interesting. I did show you that one image of sort of a stand which had one of the sustainable development goals in a kind of a campus pathway. And that's there because the university, with Vivian Lofness and one of my colleagues and others very involved in this as well. I think Ambassador Mendelson, who runs the Washington program for Heinz College, very involved. We're actually doing an audit. We're doing the university doing a university audit through SDG goals. And so, kind of events and statements and sort of everything that filter is being applied. And when that ends, I'm not on the committee, but when that ends and what we sort of draw from it, I think we'll be finding out in the near term. The city, SDGs are rife in the city. We installed them into the planning documents. It became part of it's sort of built into the work that we did in 2030 with the Pittsburgh 2030 work. It's built into the way that the city has been changing its fleet and all that kind of work. I would have to go back, but when I left, it wasn't like when I left in late 2019 that we had an SDG, we basically established an SDG checklist for our planning work, but there was not an SDG checklist that the city was using at that time that I was using. I think my colleagues that were have been developing this in the sort of the division that's about sustainability focused in the city. They'll be going to COP26 and so forth because of the city's relationship to C40 and all sorts of other work. They may be presenting on how they're using SDG goals, and I don't know.
Okay. Well, just moving on now, we've only have a few minutes left. I'm going to try to squeeze in maybe three more very, very quick questions. One that just came into the chat room to expand upon demographic analysis. Are young people staying? What is the population characteristics that you see in Pittsburgh now? Old, aging, or young people staying?
Pittsburgh is an older city. It's one of the reasons why our population doesn't grow even when we get new people, because people pass away. But we actually in the 2000s we moved towards doing much better at keeping young people here, and people in their 20s, 30s stay here. There was a whole generation, the lost generation. More than 50% of the people in the region left the region in their 20s and 30s in the sort of period of steel's collapse, 1980s, 90s into the aughts. Now actually people stay. So that was happening when I got here. It was also part of our missions to keep that going on. We're also, demographically, the city is slightly over 25% African American or Black. It also has a relatively small, compared to most major North or Mid-Atlantic cities, a relatively small Latinx population, although that's beginning to change. And then there is a small Asian population as well. Sort of, it was largely much of it in relationship to the universities that are here. But it's not the most diverse city. It is not a majority minority city, but it is a complex city in terms of its heritage and diversity on many scales, and economically, it's not a rich city. We have a relatively high poverty rate, whereas the region is actually closer to the national average, but the city itself is poorer than the region. Not an unusual kind of circumstance and that's a brief demographic portrait.
Yeah, well, in terms of people staying, especially after university, you mentioned not only Carnegie Mellon where you are now, but Pitt in passing. How important, Ted Liebman asks, how important are good universities in assuring a successful future for a city? You think of Boston, people staying on after university. Is that the same pattern in Pittsburgh these days or not?
Yes, although, Boston has so many universities,
Yeah.
it could shut down everything else and still be thriving. That's a very unusual condition. We're not that. but I don't have the percentage of the economy for you of the university here, but it is big, and employment, as well as the hospital system, because we have a university system that's unusual for a city our size. We have a hospital system that's very unusual for a city our size. And both of those have been really instrumental.
My last question relates to the connectivity questions, regional connectivity. We heard in prior talks from Barcelona and Rio especially, but also from Ljubljana and tautologically from Trane as it took over, it merged with the adjacent communities politically. How important the regional connectivity is, particularly given the circumstances that you were describing demographically, with people leaving the middle of the city at a certain point in time, and the metropolitan population, as Ben Moore has pointed out, has stayed very stable. Uh, my question goes beyond that. I've been looking at Hyperloop and took some of my students to see a demonstration Hyperloop facility in California. Um, Pittsburgh is one of the cities that signed on early as a possible destination, of Hyperloop tunneling, connecting Chicago and Pittsburgh by high speed, environmentally friendly, let's say, transit system, either through Cleveland or Cincinnati, if I recall. Um, Even this calendar year, there's more information in the Pittsburgh newspapers about, federal analysis of whether this is feasible. Where where do you come down on the importance of high-speed rail of this nature, or Amtrak, having a greater way of connecting cities that rely on each other and aren't completely autonomous? Well,
Uh,
sorry.
no.
Amtrak.
First, I'm going to honor Lance's question.
Yeah,
Lance put in a question about the arts, and it's absolutely true. The arts
yeah,
in the story of
of course.
Pittsburgh, and sort of in the 80s and 70s and 80s and
Yeah,
90s, and even today, is that Pittsburgh made a huge investment, often from the foundation community, a huge investment in the arts,
yeah.
which is in fact been quite effective in the identity of the city and the economy of the city, and in the success of the city, and has become increasingly diverse, as well as its sort of blue chip institutions in the last decade. And I'm happy to talk about that another time. But it's interesting. We do have an Amtrak connection. It is a weak Amtrak connection, even though we had more railroads running through us than practically anywhere in the world. And it's tricky. We're just a little too far for some of those systems to work. We're like we are a fur piece from Philadelphia and New York. So when you look at the most successful kind of rail focused kind of national networks around the globe, usually distances of like the New York to Pittsburgh distance is long even for those. I mean, not for a kind of hyperloop, not for a true super high speed rail, but I also feel like, if, as you know from your work, the idea of the environmental review to actually bring effective high speed rail through this country, it seems, it's like a Acela. It's the tracks aren't good enough, and we will never make the tracks good enough to go for Acela to go at the speed it should go, because people will never want it to go that fast next to their house. I'm not trying to be a skeptic about it, but I think we do. I hate to throw cold water on it, but I do think that you absolutely have to improve the transit system. But I absolutely have to make. There's no reason that we shouldn't have a better and stronger Amtrak connection, because we are, especially, we're even almost better connected to the Midwest than we are to back east in certain ways in rail terms. But we are, we get to Harrisburg, and then, you're off to the races and getting to the Northeast Corridor in Philadelphia, and then we have that connectivity. So yes, I would put resources into improving Amtrak frequency, speed, all that's doable. I don't know that it needs to move to the kind of high-speed rail model right away, because I think I think there's something that's, if we could actually get our trains to run at 80 miles per hour, or on a regular basis on routes like Pittsburgh to Harrisburg, it would be and on to Philadelphia, it would be transformative. And so sometimes I think that just imagine going as fast as cars, without all the hassle of parking and so forth, and also environmental degradation, is one of the places that I would put my energies in terms of that. and you're talking about big region. I mean, the local one is a different story with the Port Authority and buses and all the, and BRT or other things. So that's a slightly, and we do have light rail, but that's a different story.
Well, Ray, I can't thank you enough for making time. I know how busy today is for you. And so we were experimenting with an earlier start date to accommodate your schedule, but also because we think maybe that before things get really busy in people's workdays or their lives, an earlier start might make sense, and we might continue that for our next program on November 4th. That remains to be seen. But please, everyone on the call, thank you so much for lively chat room, excellent questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. A lot of additional information. Thank you, Ben Moore. And thank you, collaborating organizations, and mostly thank you, Ray. This is very, very informative, terrific talk. I really appreciate you taking the time today. And yes, thank you, Perkins Eastman Sustainability Team, for making it possible for us to be here today. Nothing about the Pirates, nothing about the Steelers. I should hasten to add that my wife's family is from Weston, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh. And I've got a Steelers shirt, a Steelers jersey, a Steelers table, but I try to cover them up with blue tablecloths. And don't get me going about Mazeroski, or else we'll be here for quite a while.
Focus on hockey. It's the future. All right. Bye. See you. Thank you very much.
The Pirates.
Bye-bye.
Take care,
Ray.
Goodbye, everybody. And
Bye-bye.
thank you all for attending.
Good rest of your day.
Bye-bye.